Welcome to the first lecture of Unit 5. Unit 5, we will be talking about chromosomal genetics. This is one of my favorite units. I really love this unit, and I hope you do too. This is going to cover a lot of different topics. Chromosomal genetics, in order to understand it, before we can start talking about it, you've got to understand two processes. One of them is cell reproduction. We've already talked a little bit about cell reproduction in mitosis, but for chromosomal genetics, I'm talking about what's in your genes. So I can't go through mitosis for our discussion on chromosomal genetics. I've got to go through something else, and we call that meiosis. So you will learn meiosis, and then we will apply that to chromosomal genetics and what happens when things go wrong. To begin with, I'm going to have a discussion about reproduction and why reproduction is so important. Reproduction, a definition for this, and what I would expect you to get out of it, is the continuation of life from one generation to the next. You are an example of what happens during reproduction. Your parents gave rise to you. So it is the continuation of life from their generation to your generation. All organisms alive today arose from pre-existing organisms, which makes sense. Take maybe your pet dog. Everybody knows about my dog Truman. He was born into this world by his mom named Astra, and his dad's name was Ammo. He came from a pre-existing organism that happened to be a dog, and so therefore he is a dog. You came from your parents. So your parents are human, so you are human. You had to come from somewhere, and it's from that previous generation. There is a distinction for the different types of organisms. If I am a small organism, reproduction is usually a one-time event. For some small organisms, you get one chance and that is it. Flies are a lot like that. They will reproduce a lot of flies. They will have many offsprings, but they only get one chance. Their lifespans are so short that they get one chance and that is it. So flies are a good example of this. However, if you are a more complex organism, then reproduction may continue for days, months, or years. Pandas are a good example of an animal that is only fertile for a couple of days, and then that is it for the year. There are some animals that are fertile for months or years. Humans are an example of this. My mom only had 2 kids. There's me and there's my brother, and there are 3 years that separate us. So humans are fertile over many years, so it just depends on the species itself. But a more complex organism has a lot more freedom and a lot more choice sometimes when it comes to reproduction and continuing on their species. All of this leads up to something that you've heard before, and that is life cycles. Life cycles are all the events that occur between the beginning of one generation and the beginning of the next generation. Now, if you put humans into this concept, this is not going to make any sense to you. Say you look at your grandparents. If grandparents live for hopefully several generations of their family. My grandparents, my dad's parents, they were around for my generation and my cousin's generations that came after me. So they were around for their children's generations, then those children's children, and then those children's children. So my grandmother was a great-great-grandmother by the time that she died. She was around for several generations. Most animals, most organisms don't get that privilege. They don't live as long because they have more struggles to face in life than we do as humans. We are the top of the food chain. Most animals only have one generation, and then they will pass on. They will move on. Survival of the fittest. Those that live are the ones that can reproduce and pass on their genes to the next generation and continue the species. The main purpose behind reproduction is biological success. That is the purpose of reproduction. This is why it is done. Biological success is measured by the continuation of the species. If reproduction is a success, the species continues on. They can live their everyday life. The reverse of that, if reproduction fails, the species will eventually die out. One good example of this is the panda bear. If China and some of the researchers didn't strive to preserve the panda bear, it would become an extinct species. It would no longer be around. Pandas are only fertile for just a few days out of every year, so it is very hard for them to propagate their own species. When you put that into account that China is getting bigger and bigger and taking more and more of their land, taking their habitat, they now also no longer have any place to live. Their land, their home is getting smaller and smaller. And so that works against them as well when it comes to trying to preserve their species. If humans hadn't stepped in and taken over and come up with the sanctuaries that exist in China, the panda would probably be gone at this time and period. Woolly mammoths, if you've ever seen Ice Age, the big woolly mammoth, and I can't remember his name, he thinks for a long time that he is the last of his species until he meets his, future girlfriend, future wife, and then I think they end up having a family. I don't remember, I haven't seen all of the Ice Age movies, but for a while, he was the last of his species. He was the only other woolly mammoth that he knew. And if he can't reproduce, then his species dies. And we know that eventually the woolly mammoths did die out because their environment changed and then eventually there were no more. So if reproduction fails, the species will eventually die out and they will no longer be around. Now, reproduction can be divided into two different categories. You can say that it is a sexual reproduction or it is sexual reproduction. If I go into just a little bit of asexual reproduction, I can relate it to something that you already know, that you have already learned. Asexual reproduction, just to give you a definition, is when a new organism arises from a single parent due to its division into two new identical daughter cells. The key words for this, and I'm hoping you're picking them out, it is a single parent that splits in half to create two new identical daughter cells. Where have you heard this before? And what process goes along with this? Hopefully you're speaking out and telling me that it is mitosis. This is the process that you learned right before Thanksgiving. Mitosis, where you take a single cell, a skin cell, stomach cell, lung cell, and I basically take it and I split it in half. Just to kind of write it down again, mitosis, you have 4 different phases. There is prophase, metaphase, which is my favorite, anaphase, and telophase, which is usually connected with cytokinesis. The cells that go through mitosis are what we call somatic cells. These are skin cells, stomach cells, and most of the other cells that you can talk about. Basically, what I'm talking about are body cells. Some bacteria also go through asexual reproduction, and we call that binary fission. So don't forget about those as well. On the flip side of that, you have sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction is when two different reproductive cells from two different parents, and I'm going to put usually in parentheses. That's not always the case. Think of flowers. But most of the time with sexual reproduction, you're getting two different reproductive cells from two different parents unite to form a new organism. Keywords to take out of this one. It is two different cells from two different parents to form one new organism. That is your key parts to this. This process, and the one that we will spend time on this unit, is called meiosis. Meiosis is a little bit different from mitosis. It has a lot of the same phases. However, it is a little bit more complex, and it has two different sides to it than just one. And we will get into that in class. So don't worry your pretty little heads about it just yet. But sexual reproduction arises from the process we call meiosis. I'm going to fill you in a little bit more so that now you can talk about the two different cells that come together in this process. Sexual reproduction is the union of nuclei from two different parental organisms. Each parent produces a different kind of specialized reproductive cell. This reproductive cell, blanketly, whether it is from a female parent or a male parent, is called a gamete. So all of you produce gametes, but then you produce specific gametes depending on whether or not you are male or female. The gametes will usually differ in appearance, and they contain fewer genes than the parent cell that created them. This is called being haploid, and we will get into what that means more specifically, but for now, it just means that the daughter cells that are created are going to have fewer genes than the parent cells that gave rise to them, and then we call that haploid. Two types of gametes. One type of gamete is called, of course, the sperm. This, of course, is produced by males. It is usually very small, and it consists of a nucleus, a tail to move, and an energy generator. The other side of the coin is for us females, and that is called an egg. Another word that you can hear it referred to is also called an ovum. That is the more scientifically correct word. This, of course, is produced by the female organism. Compared to the sperm, it is usually pretty big, so it is usually very large compared to the sperm. And it usually consists of a nucleus, because all cells have to have nuclei, and a food reserve. When these two things meet, when a sperm and an egg meet, it is called fertilization. So when a sperm and an ovum meet and unite. How this works in a little bit more detail. A sperm cell fertilizes the ovum by penetrating the outer membrane and entering the cytoplasm of the ovum. This simple act allows the sperm to introduce its genes into the ovum, and it allows them to combine the two. The fertilized egg is called a zygote. As we go into meiosis, this whole section about sexual reproduction will come into play because it is the basis of the process called meiosis. It is how it works. It's where it starts. It doesn't work like mitosis, where I take just a parent cell, I replicate everything I'm going to need, and then I split the cell into two different pieces. This one, I have to have sexual reproduction at its core before I can go through the process of meiosis. My last thing, and my question that I leave for you, and I want you to try to bring an answer to class, is why is this form of reproduction important? I've given you some hints, but I want you to take it a little bit further and think about why this form of reproduction, sexual reproduction, is so important. Bring your answer to class, and I will see you then.